Well, today's speaker certainly needs no introduction to the Oakmonters. Since Bob Kirk and his wife moved to Oakmont 14 years ago, he has given 8 Sunday symposium lectures and taught a lifelong learning class earlier this year. In addition, he has completed his 6th year is completing his 6th year as president of the World Affairs Council of Sonoma County. He and his wife are enthusiastic travelers, and he has been a cruise lecturer on 62 different cruises. He loves to talk. Bob earned his PhD in history at UC Davis. I couldn't find anywhere on the web when it was, but that's all right. He taught history at Clear Lake College for 20 years. Upon retirement, he moved into Oakmont, and he has been an adjunct professor at Santa Rosa College since that time. Santa Rosa College has a website in which students can respond to the teachers and the courses that they have taken. He has 9 pages of comments from students. But there was one that really struck me well. In a website open to students, one student wrote, "He is an enthusiastic lecturer, but I guess I should expect that. He's lived through most of that history." And today, November the 11th, is Veterans Day. And I too would like to encourage you to take advantage on this nice day to observe our Oakmont Veterans Parade. But to add to these festivities, today Bob will give us a review of what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation and the effects of demobilization of our military personnel from that war as well as others. It's a pleasure to introduce our own Bob Kirk.
I don't know about looking at that website. I don't do it anymore. The last time I did, a student wrote, Kirk is an older guy and he talks like one. I was so bummed. I mean, I go like, dude, what's up with that? How many veterans do we have with us today? Oh my gosh, okay. That's wonderful. If you have a question while I'm talking, or if there's something that you'd like to add, maybe you know something more about it than I do, or something of interest, please feel free to raise your hand. And we have 2 volunteers with microphones who will come over and give you a mic. Well, I'm going to talk about exactly what Phil said, and that is what happened to the veterans after World War II. And I'm going to compare them with what happened to veterans after other wars in America. And what happened to veterans after World War II, for a lot of them, was quite a good thing, not only for the veterans, but for America, because it launched America into what I think of as a golden age between about 1947 and the mid-1970s. But let's take a look at that. So I'm honored to be here. I speak as an historian, certainly not as a World War II veteran, because I was rejected being too short. I was 4 years old. No, not you, me. I was shorter. I was 4 years old. I was pretty short. They didn't have a uniform for me. So here's what Norman Rockwell showed as the veteran returns. And look at the housing. A lot of veterans did return to that kind of housing. So housing in America, as we'll say in a few minutes, was fairly substandard. They didn't need it in 1827. They needed it in, or 1817, they needed it in 1787. The Grand Army of the Republic after the Civil War did a whole lot better because they were a huge group And they were allied, of course, with the GOP, the Republican Party. And they did get pensions. What happened to the Confederates? They got zilch. No pensions whatsoever because they were on the losing side. And the states in the South, the 11 states in the South were broke. So they got very little. After the First World War, the veterans were promised bonuses in 1944. Well, they didn't know if they'd need them in 1944 or not, but they sure as heck needed them in 1932 in the very depths of the Depression. So as a result, about 20,000 veterans came to Washington, D.C. Some of them rode the rails, some of them came in cars, some of them came in buses and trains. And they petitioned Congress to get their bonuses now, 1932. And it probably would have been a pretty good idea because they would have spent it all, paid some debts, provided food for their family, and helped to end the Depression or to ameliorate, maybe not end the Depression, but to ameliorate the conditions. But Congress refused. These were the great-grandparents of the Tea Partiers in Congress at that time. Refused. So the veterans started to, about 6,000 veterans were sent home. They had their way paid, but the rest of them decided they were going to stay. Why? They had nowhere else to go or didn't have the money to get home. So President Hoover felt that Hooverville, which they had established, the tattered camp at Anacostia Flats, just across the Potomac from Washington, was a health hazard, and he ordered General MacArthur and his assistant, General Eisenhower, to disperse the crowd, the veterans and their families, some of them with wives and children. So MacArthur brought in tanks, tear gas, the whole thing, and sent these guys home. So that wasn't very much of a bonus whatsoever. Oh, and of course, that's one reason why Hoover got 15 million votes and Roosevelt got 22 million in the election of 1932. So at last, World War II was over. The United States did not choose to get into World War II. Sentiment on the home front before World War II in the 1930s was very much against getting into war. In 1935, Congress passed neutrality legislation, which would have prevented us from loaning money to belligerents, sending arms to belligerents, sailing on belligerent ships, and so forth. So there's no way we were going to get into this war. It just seemed like something else going on in Europe. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, drew us in against Japan, but not necessarily against Germany and Italy. On December 11th, 1941, both Hitler and Mussolini, thinking that Americans couldn't fight their way out of a wet paper bag, declared war on us. They didn't ask their people. The Italian people were stunned, absolutely speechless. I don't know if you've ever seen a speechless Italian, but it's quite a sight as a mass group. So in the war, about 13 million people had served, including 216,000 women who had enlisted. Some of these were drafted, some of these enlisted. About 405,000 were killed. And 670,000 suffered wounds, at least wounds that you could see. Others had mental wounds. And what we had to do now was to discharge and send home all of these people. So here MacArthur is signing the peace on the battleship Missouri, and this is being celebrated throughout the United States by just about everybody. There's a huge group in Times Square, hundreds of thousands of people celebrating San Francisco, as I told my class, remembering the home front right here in this room in October, had riots in which 11 people were killed and buses were smashed and so forth. But that was unusual. For the rest of the country, people were pretty law-abiding. Well, everybody was pretty happy, except for some of those who had lost loved ones. 13-year-old Henrietta Bingham lost 2 brothers killed as teenagers on bomber missions. And she recalled, on VJ Day, my parents sat down and listened to the excitement in the small town where we lived. Sirens going off, and they didn't even leave the house. They never recovered. 8-year-old Vicki LeCount was playing in Minot, South Dakota, and there were shouts of joy, dancing in the streets, clanging of pots and pans. I was not rejoicing, she said. The war never ended for me because my dad never came home. He's buried in Luxembourg. So this happened, and lots of families, and gold stars went up on in people's windows. This is the most famous picture from the war, and there was this exuberance that you could get away with this sort of thing. You could get away with this sort of thing, and she probably, went right along with it. So our heroes return, and they came back on 843 troop and combat ships. Cruise lines, cruise lines were pressed into service at the time. The Queen Mary had room for 2,000 passengers, but they squeezed 15,000 people onto the ship. And by a lot of the people coming back, a lot of the men coming back from Europe expected then to have to go to Japan to fight, but by August the 15th, the war was over. So they were pretty happy that they didn't have to go to Japan. By September 1945, the government was discharging 25,000 a day, but that was still too slow. Well, finally, they were reduced within 2 years to about 1.5 million. And all over the world, GIs left the graffiti that said Kilroy was here, along in certain places with some babies. Well, what the GIs were returning to, food rationing lasted into September, and in fact the 35-mile speed limit did as well. Shoe rationing lasted till the end of October of 1945, so there were still some shortages. Women still drew nylons on the nylon lines on the back of their legs, and all the GIs returning noticed that, I'm sure. The movies were big. The biggest movie of 1944 was Going My Way with Bing Crosby, and about 85 million people went every week. Men still wore ties for dinner, as we see even in some old TV shows. So what they were returning to, people were listening to radio as cheap entertainment. Every neighborhood had a neighborhood grocery store. We just happened to be driving by 9th Street yesterday over on the other side of the freeway, and here was an old grocery store left over from that time. And I can remember as a child, and you can too, being able to easily walk to a grocery store, a mom and pop store. And you'd have to go often because we had ice boxes and the iceman would come. Everybody didn't yet have a refrigerator. And when my mother washed her clothes, she had to use a wringer, a hand-cranked wringer to wring out the clothes. But we had milk delivery. Milk came every other day or so. And bread was all of 9 cents, which was pretty good. 7,000 Americans had TV sets, which mostly in New York City. And in November of 1945, the first electronic computer was introduced called the Electronic Numerical Integrator Analyzer and Computer, ENIAC, probably as big as the Burger Center, and had 17,468 vacuum tubes. That was the ancestor of your iPhone. So that's pretty good. Well, what did people expect? All kinds of people, 2.6 million people were laid off. About 30 million people had left their home counties during the war and gone somewhere else. A lot of them came out, for instance, to the Bay Area, others to Los Angeles, Seattle, Mobile, Alabama, Norfolk, Virginia, and they got jobs, good jobs that paid really good wages. And now they were going to get laid off. And when the war ended, the unemployment rate had been 1.9%. After the war, it's going to go all the way up to 4%, which we would think is pie in the sky today, and would have made Obama very happy during the election. But we never did go back to a depression, although people thought we were going to. In 1940, there had still been 17% of people unemployed. During the war, these workers who had come from all over the country produced 300,000 airplanes, 75,000 ships. Can you believe that? 86,000 tanks. But now it's all over. War surplus is sold at 20% of cost. $21 billion of aviation contracts are canceled. 66 aviation plants are reduced to 16 plants. The Ford Willow Run plant, the biggest in the world, was closed. And we feared the economy couldn't employ all of the returning 12 million GIs. That was just common sense. In fact, the president of the University of New Mexico said, immediately after the war, there will be a brief restocking period when business and employment will be fairly good. When the restocking stimulus has spent its force, however, the outlook for the decades ahead is for continuous chronic world depression, broken by occasional periods of severe depression. I don't know what the difference between severe and chronic depression is, but it doesn't sound too good. A poll taken in 1944 expected 50% of people expected to go right back to the Depression. In fact, Paul Samuelson, who wrote the economics book, which put me to sleep during the war, during college, not the war, college was no war, that was fun. He wrote in 1943, the final conclusion to be drawn from our experience at the end of the last war is inescapable. Were the war to end suddenly within the next 6 months, in the greatest haste to demobilize our armed forces, to liquidate price controls, to shift from astronomical deficits to even larger deficits, then there would be ushered in the greatest period of unemployment and industrial dislocation which any economy has ever faced. He was totally and absolutely wrong, and he was one of the greatest economic minds of his time. One thing about economists, they're like weather forecasters. They can have severe disagreements, and a large number of them are often wrong. In fact, General Frank Hines of Virginia thought the greatest danger is that of having idle veterans drifting aimlessly around the country, as they did in Germany after the First World War, and as they did after the Napoleonic Wars, and become really bandits. So wounds, psychological and physical. This is, who's seen this film? This is one, if you haven't seen this is still, it won the 1946 Academy Awards, still one of the best films ever produced. And Dana Andrews is Captain Fred Derry, who was a soda jerk before the war, but becomes an officer in the war, and comes home to the woman that he married briefly, and they were total strangers. They had been when they met. they were even more strangers. They were even more estranged when he came home. Sergeant Al Stevenson had been a banker before the war. That's Frederick March, married to the long-suffering Myrna Loy, because he took up drinking big time after the war, just to assuage his problems. And this fellow, Homer Parrish, was actually a disabled veteran who they enlisted to play in this film, because I guess they couldn't find any actor who wanted the job bad enough to disarm himself. So this guy did a very, very good job, and here's his girlfriend wants to get married to him, and he doesn't think that he's going to be a very good spouse for her. So people came back, and they were different people from the time. These men were different from the time that they had left. Many of the women were too, because they had to be self-sufficient. Many of them had supported themselves, supported children, and so forth. So when her husband returned, a woman recalled, "We were so glad that we were together again. We had known each other, we had known such a long separation, because after all, we were married only 3 years, and then we were separated for 4. So we were strangers in a way to each other. When he came back, we had evolved each on our own in these very important years, and it wasn't at all easy." Well, 670,000 men suffered war wounds. And here's, I think this is a much later picture than World War II, but of course this still goes on today. And others, what's...
Alma Mater, Letterman.
Is that right, Jerry? Yeah. Oh my gosh. So that's where you...
That's where I did part of my residency.
Your residence, okay. Yeah, Jerry's a retired physician. So in 1980, the mental scars were called post-traumatic stress disorder, which is pretty good description. And so 83,000 vets ended up in hospitals. There was a man who could not walk at all. He was tested in every way. He had no physical disability at all. It was all up here. He was just prevented from walking. Others came home and they suffered from alcoholism, flashbacks, nightmares. Why? Well, there's a very good book called Wartime by Paul Fussell. In 6 weeks of fighting in Normandy, Fussell writes, the 90th Division had to replace 156% of its officers and over 100% of its men. If a division was engaged for more than 3 months, the probability is that every one of the second lieutenants, all 132 of them, would have been killed or wounded. A 200-man British rifle company fighting in Normandy had only 5 of its original men. The rest were replacements. A daughter wrote after the war in America, "My father came back with battle fatigue and flashbacks. More than once, thinking he was bailing out of a burning airplane, he tried to jump from a second-story bedroom window." Other kids recalled their fathers as solemn, intolerant, frustrated, abusive, very nervous. Paul Fussell wrote, "There is no such thing as getting used," and I love this. Every time I think about sending young people to war, I think about this. "There is no such thing as getting used to combat. Every moment of combat imposes a strain so great that men will break down in direct relation to the intensity and duration of their experience." And he's talking about all men without exception. Psychiatric casualties are as inevitable as gunshot and shrapnel wounds. Given this ultimate collapse into blubbery tears of the strongest and most experienced soldiers in every outfit, the whole front line would have dissolved except for 2 things. At any given moment, all men have not yet reached that stage of collapse. And they're gradually being replaced when they do. To spare themselves the awful moment of psychological breakdown, which is with its appearance of cowardice, soldiers wanted to get wounded. For every frontline soldier in the Second World War, there was the slowly dawning and dreadful realization that there was no way out, that it was only a matter of time before they were killed or maimed or broke down completely. We're talking about everybody, every hero, that nobody was going to last through all of that. Well, we're bringing them home today in a sad mental and physical state. 1.6 million people have been deployed, men and women, to Iraq and Afghanistan. Remember, our war in Afghanistan started in 2001, so it's now, 11 years old. It's the longest war that, in my life, it's the longest war in your lifetime as well, so far as I can think of. And about 800,000, about half of these have been deployed more than once, 2-4 times. 45% have come back and filed for disability. Now, what does that get you? 10% disability gets you $127 a month today. Full disability gets you $27.69 a month. So why are 45% filing? For one thing, they can't find jobs. In fact, 14% of all homeless people are veterans, and they amount to 67,000 veterans, a little over 67,000. That's according to somebody's estimate. It could be more than that. Who in the world knows? Tens of thousands have concussions. Others have post-traumatic stress disorder. 12% of these are females. Some of the stress disorder is from sexual trauma, which I won't try to explain. So why so many traumatic experiences today? Why 45% filing, besides the fact that they have no income? Probably because they have body armor and they survive. And they have good battlefield medical assistance, so they survive. Sadly, and this I found in Time magazine in May, so I don't know what the update is, probably pretty much the same. 18 veterans in the United States kill each other every day. It seems astounding, and I read it, and it's right. At least that's what, according to Time magazine. Males are twice as likely to kill themselves as male civilians. Females are 3 times as likely to kill each other as female civilians. And the total suicides have been more than the 6,460 who died in combat as of late May. An expert said, up till 10 years ago, serving in the military seemed a protective factor against suicide. Part of the cause, I think, and so everything I've read suggests this, is that in World War II, everybody was involved. The whole country, everybody said to each other, well, don't you know there's a war on? You know, you're complaining about not getting gas or something. Don't you know there's a war on? Today, do you know there's a war on? Not really, not unless you're watching television, reading the paper, or unless you know somebody who's involved in it. And a lot of us don't. You know, we're pretty sheltered from this experience. So that may be one cause, because these guys come home, guys and girls, and they're ignored. Here's happier thoughts. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. And this is signed by President Roosevelt. It's called the Marshall Plan for America. And this guaranteed your job back within 90 days. Now that wasn't always as good as it sounded. A woman recalled, after the war, my husband went back to Shell Oil. But he had to pick up from where he had left off 4 years earlier. As far as salary goes, that was 6 years before, and the living standards had changed so much, but he got living standard raises. But he missed his promotion. He was behind his promotions. He was behind everybody else his age. So you miss keeping up with things. They got unemployment insurance, which some vets called the 5220 Club. So you got that for a year. And they got a year of education plus additional months depending on their service time. So you could get up to 4 years of education. The government paid $500 for your tuition. The tuition at Harvard was $400. So you could go anywhere just about. And they applied to very good schools and they got admitted. And they got low-cost loans for a business or for a home. It was this act, which was very courageous on the part of Congress, and which really propelled us into what I call an economic golden age. So 2 million vets went to college, which was very wonderful. Others went to trade school, but so if they were 25 or under when they were inducted, they got at least a year of training. Now, most people had not gone to college. In 1940, according to the census, only 5% of people had college degrees. Only 25% had graduated from high school, and only 40% had gone past the 8th grade. So an 8th grade education was pretty good for a lot of people in 1940. But this made us a far more educated group of people. College had been for the wealthy or selected few, but now it was for more average men. And the government not only paid your tuition, it bought your books and it gave you a monthly allowance, and even more if you were married. Well, let me get back to this. I'm not finished talking about this. Fortune magazine said, the class of 1949 was the best, the most mature, the most responsible, and the most self-disciplined group of students in history. They refused to wear freshman beanies or to light upperclassmen cigarettes or to join fraternities if they didn't want to. They didn't need all that nonsense. Ex-Marine Ed Andrusko recalled, after the war, I felt I could handle anything in the civilian world, and I took on all challenges. I started college the day after discharge. We returning vets took pride in our accomplishments. We were ambitious for the future. A professor at Lehigh University said, they're old enough to realize they know very little. And that helps a great deal in teaching them. They are the most receptive and responsive students I've ever had. A professor told a reporter, because of government funds, the college doesn't have to kowtow to idiots anymore to make money. I have no comment on that because I'm still teaching. President Conant of Harvard University said they were the most mature and promising students Harvard had ever had. And a man in Pennsylvania Lee Falk, expected to return to his pre-war jobs of caddying on the golf course, racking cue balls at the pool room. If lucky, he would later get a job stoking coal furnaces at the local steel mill. This was his expectation when he went into the war. Instead, he went to college on the GI Bill, became a teacher, later got a doctorate of education, and became a school principal. Impossible for him and for many others without the GI Bill. So 7 million veterans got some advanced training or college. 6 million took vocational or technical courses, and the government spent $14.5 billion on educational benefits. Very well done. Very, very good idea. After the Korean War, veterans did get educational benefits, but they got a lump sum every month, and they had to pay their own tuition because it was found with the GI Bill of 1944 that some colleges were raising their tuition rates astronomically just to soak up the government funds. Hard to believe. Americans saved an astronomical $140 billion during the war, much different from what we've had in recent years. And they saved about 25% of everything. Why? Everybody had a good job, everybody was making a good living, just about. And as I told my class on the home front, little kids moved up to their big brothers' jobs, big brothers went into the service. So everybody and women went to work, and people had a good job. There was nothing to buy. You couldn't buy anything. Everything was rationed. All materials were prioritized. So people had to save. And they were encouraged all the time to buy bonds. That's all you ever heard. Buy bonds. So this led to what economists have called the Great Compression during and just after the war years. And what they meant by that is that there was a less disparity between the very rich and the very poorest. The middle class grew enormously. And by the end of the war, the top 1% had about 8% of the income. Today, the top 1% receives 43% of the income in the United States. And 400 people have as much wealth as 150 million Americans. 400 people. And as I tell my class, if we take all the classrooms on the floor we're on, there's about 400 people here. We have as much wealth as all the people maybe west of the Mississippi or west of Chicago. Pretty good. So we have what economists call a greater Gini coefficient, which means a greater disparity of wealth today. So housing had decayed quite a bit. According to the census of 1940, 1/3 of houses lacked running water. 1/3 of houses lacked running water in America in 1940. Of course, this is still at the end of the Depression. 1/4 of homes lacked electricity. 1/3 had no indoor toilet. You had to go to the outhouse. And 39% had no tub or shower. Nathan Strauss, a U.S. Housing Authority official, wrote, "Millions of families live in indescribable squalor. Slums and blighted areas are common to every American community. The sight of slums has become so familiar that the eye is dulled, and the mind has long accepted slum housing as unavoidable." And these kinds of humorous cartoons were ubiquitous at the time. This is a better house because the sitting room is bigger. But it wasn't so much. It wasn't all that funny. Young couples after the war and during the war began marriage in attics, basements, and outbuildings. My family lived in Oakland, and we had a guest room, which was always full of somebody who had met my uncle back in college or some relative from another part of the country. Somebody was always in our guest room. 95% of all dwellings were occupied, and 1.7 million families doubled up. The Republicans had a sign that said, "Under Truman, 2 families in every garage." It's a pretty good sign. We had 28 million adequate housing units after the war, but we had 37 million families. 28 million houses for 37 million families. A newspaper in Norwood, Ohio reported that a man strangled his wife to death. People called the police station wondering if the house was now available. And so a very severe housing shortage. The GI Bill guaranteed a loan of $25,000 or 60% of cost, whichever was less. And they gave out $16 billion in loans for homes, businesses, and farms. And mortgage interest was tax deductible, so why not? Nothing down and payments of $89 a month or less. So this launched us into a golden age because people had saved so much money, there was nothing to buy. There was a great need for houses, automobiles, and for all the stuff that went in houses. And a man who started to take care of this need was William Levitt. Most builders before the war, and my uncle was one of them before I went into the Seabees, would build a spec home or build a home for somebody who had ordered one, and that was pretty much it. But Levitt started to build homes on mass production. He bought 7.3 square miles on Long Island near Queens. He said what it amounted to was a reversal of the Detroit assembly line. There the car moved while the workers stayed at their stations. In the case of our houses, it was the workers who moved, doing the same job at different locations. So nobody had ever done that before. Every house took about a week because of all the specialized labor, and he was able to buy materials wholesale, of course, or at a very good price. And this is what I told you already. So Time magazine said about Levitt, every 100 feet the truck stopped and dropped off identical bundles of lumber, pipe, and bricks, shingles, and copper tubing, all as neatly packaged as loaves from a bakery. Near the bundles, giant machines with an endless chain of buckets ate into the earth, taking just 15 minutes to dig a narrow 4-foot trench around a 25 by 32-foot rectangle. Then came more trucks loaded with cement and laid a foundation. After the machines came the men. On slabs already dry, they worked in crews of 2 or 3, laying bricks, raising studs, nailing boards, painting, sheathing, shingling. Each crew did its special job and hurried on to the next site. That was absolutely a brilliant thing to do. And here's one of the Cape Cod houses. He had houses that were Cape Cod and colonial, so 2 different types of houses. His ad in the New York Times said, "This is Levittown, all yours for $58 down. You're a lucky fellow, Mr. Veteran. Uncle Sam and the world's largest builder have made it possible for you to live in a charming house in a delightful community without having to pay through the eye teeth." The ad ran on a Monday. By the end of the next day, 1,400 houses were sold because of that ad. They had a living room, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bath, 800 square feet, $79.90. Today, I think young couples expect a lot more. But if you're like me, we were raised in a house very similar to this. Also, there were churches, schools, shopping centers, all the things that you could need. By 1951, Levitt built 17,500 houses. And he had imitators around the country. The 10 largest builders built an average of 1,400 homes. And one of them was right here in Santa Rosa. And this was Hugh Codding, who just died, I think, in the last year or so. But he built Montgomery Village. Now, in researching for my class on the home front, who in the world was Montgomery? That was Billy Montgomery, the first Santa Rosan to be killed in the war, killed at Pearl Harbor. So Montgomery Drive, Montgomery Village, Montgomery, everything named after Billy Montgomery. Gail LeBaron wrote of Hugh Codding, "Hugh Codding changed Santa Rosa more dramatically and more quickly than any change had come before, with the possible exception of the '06 earthquake." Codding had been discharged from the Seabees with $400 in cash. He had built spec homes before the war. In 1949, getting loans from people, he bought prune and walnut orchards on Farmers Lane. And he put up 2,600 homes, which sold faster than he could lay the foundations for. For publicity one time, he built a house in less than 4 hours and built a church in 5 hours and 16 minutes. Unbelievable. And in 1950, he put up the Montgomery Village Shopping Center. So just as the Homestead Act of 1862 filled the prairies with farms, the GI Bill of 1944 filled suburbia with homes. You all have memories, and one of my memories as a child was riding with my parents from Oakland down to San Jose and going past what became San Lorenzo. And when I had seen it before, it was farm and orchard. When I saw it right after the war, it was the type of housing that Levitt was doing back east. So it was an instant city with shopping centers, churches, schools, and so forth. And of course, with the houses came growth of ancillary industries, appliances, furniture, gardening, and so forth. By 1960, for the first time ever, a majority of Americans lived in suburbs, 60 million people, and cities lost population. Well, the other thing Americans needed was new cars. And I can remember as a child on my street when neighbors got a new car, we'd all go over and look at it, admire it, and smell the inside. And this was really a big deal because people had not had cars for a long time. The last car was produced on January the 20th, 1942, for civilians, because Pearl Harbor had been, less than a month before. Just a month before. Cars built during the war were for the military. So a car that sold for $500 in 1938 might cost 3 times that in 1943. Cars were wearing out, and so were the tires, which were recapped, repatched endlessly. And in 1946, Detroit produced 2.1 million cars, and they all sold quickly for $1,000 to $2,500. And we had cheap gas, the golden age of autos. And you can remember when gas was 18 cents and 5 guys would run out, give you trading stamps, a drinking mug, and wash your windshield for you. Ah, those were the good old days. Why did Detroit do so well? Well, we didn't have any competition from the Japanese. We had no competition from the Germans. We had very weak competition from the British, who were devastated from winning 2 world wars, just to become a second-class power after all of that. And of course, the Russians weren't producing cars, except for their top leaders. And then we had 76 million babies, the baby boomers. So beware, Oakmonters, they're coming. They're here, yes. I have very good baby boomer neighbors next door, so we're glad to have them. So the marriage rate for men came down to 22, for women came down to 20. And my class at the junior college is rather amazed at that. But I can recall leaving high school in the 1950s, and if you knew anybody whatsoever in a factory, you'd get a job. I graduated from San Leandro High School, and you could go to work for the Chevrolet plant in Oakland, Frieden Calculator, or Peterbilt Motors, companies like that. So everybody went out and they got a job, and they got a very good salary, and they'd married their girlfriend in high school, and her name was usually Betty Sue, and they'd have 2.4 kids, and they'd get the house within 2 or 3 years because they were making very good money. And the average age for girls getting married was 20. And if a girl got to be 24, 25, oh my gosh, she was kind of hopeless at that point. back in the 1950s, not today. Today things have changed quite a bit. So because we had saved so much money, because we had so much need, because the government was so cooperative, because Americans became better educated, because we were eager to get ahead in this world, because our enemies had been devastated and we had very little competition from overseas, because we gave $12 billion generously to Europe as part of the Marshall Plan, and they had to buy equipment from the United States. Because of all of that, and because of the Cold War and defense spending ratcheting up again, we never went back into a depression. And we had a golden age which lasted just about till the time of the gasoline crisis of the mid-1930s, when the price of gas went up astronomically. 1970s, I'm sorry, mid-1970s. And some of our former enemies had come back, and the Japanese were now giving us, in the 1970s, a pretty good run for our money, and the Germans were selling a lot of Volkswagens over here. So this was kind of a golden age, and for many of us, we can say that if we had a 7-Up at the time, we lived pretty happily ever after.